fair share of cringy church services.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, some of them might have just been full stop bad experiences, probably, like this church isn't for us sort of things. But what I mean by that is more, it's a good service, it's a good church, it might even be your church, your regular church, but with the way the service has been led, there's just been no flow. It's just felt a bit awkward and stunted.
Yeah. And you might not necessarily think that church services, and especially service leading, come under the banner of church comms. But actually, when you think about it, for most churches, the Sunday service is going to be the main gathering of the week where the majority of the people, if not all of the people within your church family, are gathered in one place, effectively all participating in the same thing. So just as we would with preaching or thinking about music and worship, it might benefit to spend a bit of time thinking about sort of the presentation of the service itself and the way that it's led.
Yeah. And so today we're going to do that. We're going to be thinking about some key tips for leading services well. And already just by saying that, we've opened a can of worms. What does well mean? We're not looking for a professional production, just for the sake of it. And we're not looking to make the experience of the service the central focus as if that's the only important thing. Because as much as experience is important, church isn't just some sort of entertainment event that makes us feel great and like pumping the air as we walk out. The church service is about a gathering of God's people coming together to spend time in worship and in teaching so that we grow in our faith.
Yeah. And it might look different across the different denominations, especially for those of you who are a bit more traditional, where they might have a bit of a sort of more set running order of things, or if you're following specific liturgy. But even within denominations, individual churches will have their own styles based upon the tradition or just the makeup of the congregation and your community. Now, we might have a bit more of a focus on sung worship of the gathered church, or the focus may be sort of fairly strictly just on the teachings, with other things being there to point towards it. So we'll try and stay general, because we can't fully answer the questions of what is the purpose of a Sunday service for your individual context. But you should be thinking about it, so it might be a good time to revisit it as a leadership team. And we're going to have some help with us in talking about this today, and you may recognise some of these familiar voices from across Series 5.
So diving in then, whilst we could go straight to some of my personal bugbears and the most sort of cringe-inducing things that you see in the way services are led, actually, I think a really good place to start would be to listen to what Oz had to say when we asked for tips on how to lead services well.
Yeah, I think it's really important to help people in their preparation for worship. So call that the call to worship. And typically we might use some Bible verses and get people engaged through that. But I think being creative is something we've found really beneficial. So maybe it's a story, a testimony, an answered prayer, or engaging the kids and the youth so that they feel a part of the call to worship. So something energetic and engaging, but focused on grace would be something I tend to tell our service leaders. Before then, we motor on into sung worship and maybe whatever the feature of the service might be, an interview, intercession, and the sermon. But yeah, I think thinking of all ages and creativity, people get so familiar with the liturgy, the structure of church services. Some of that is good, but I think creativity really helps people go, oh yeah, this is the God we're coming to sing to and listen to.
So where Oz ended there with creativity and keeping things fresh, absolutely, that's great, and especially for people of all ages. But I don't want to be distracted from his first point there of having a call to worship. I think it's really important to have a structure and some organisation, and don't worry, we'll absolutely be coming back to that. But the point of that structure is to lead people to a place where they're ready to engage with God.
Yeah, and to be honest, like at the end of the day, isn't that like the main point of the gatherings is to worship? So sort of equipping people to do that. But another thing that I do think is important, so I'm not a parent, nor am I particularly kind of kid interested generally in life. However, I do think it is important that churches are a space where children, especially new children who are sort of experiencing church for the first few times kind of thing, that they feel comfortable and welcomed, and that I want to say delighted, but that's not that it's a sort of place for kids to be entertained, but just in that actually they have a sense of joy at being at church. The church I grew up in was always engaging with the youth and children, so it made us feel a part of the church family rather than being kind of on the peripheral. And I think that that's kind of is quite important, and it's not about it always being a kids service, but just in the whole dynamics of the church, I think that's quite important. But then going back to, how did he say it, helping people to prepare, kind of like as well in how you're sharing things on social media beforehand. Don't just say like, it'd be lovely to, come and join us or something. Let people know what the Bible verses are. Give them that ability to be prepared so that when you're coming to the Sunday service, that they kind of have an idea of what we're going to be reading and talking about, rather than going, right, here's the reading.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd not thought about it from that point of view. I mean, obviously we've talked before about helping to prepare people and lead up to that Sunday, but yeah, that's interesting as to how that relates to that call to worship and getting people in the right mindset even ahead of them walking through the door. Yeah. I think it'd be helpful to hear from Josh now, as amongst other things, he picks up on this idea of leading people to that place. But he also alludes to how we should be thinking about this in our own preparation of how we're going to lead the service.
I remember being told quite early in service leading to think of it as almost like a tour guide. Or imagine that you've got someone sat next to you who's never been to church before. And so you find yourself explaining everything that you're doing. So like, oh, we're standing up now because we're going to do this. Or, oh, we're singing now because we're going to do this. Or we're going to pray now because we do this and we believe this. And I think so often we can make assumptions like, oh, we're gonna sing now, and we might just, it's so easy to assume everyone in the room knows that we are singing about God, to God, for His glory. Whereas if you've never been to church before, you're like, what the heck are we doing? Like, is this just like karaoke? This is like songs that they enjoy doing, or any of these things. So I think it's, on one level, I try and keep that in mind, for I'm kind of like a guide for anyone who hasn't been to church before, for who this is a new experience. But also as a reminder, like if you've had a really rough week and you come into church and you've got your kids with you and you're just knackered and you feel rubbish, and actually all you want to do is hide away in a toilet and look at your phone and just check out. But actually to be reminded, like, God is good. We're going to lead people in worship together. We're going to join in this, and regardless of the sort of week or morning or day you've had. So I think it's, when I talk about being a guide, it's not just for new people who are new to church, but I think for all of us to have that reminder to be kind of assisted into the right gear almost to worship. So that's one part. And then something else that was kind of drilled in during curacy was be the thermostat rather than thermostat, not the thermometer. Like if you're leading a service and you're starting it and no one seems engaged, no one even seems to want to be there, rather than mirroring that, which is like human instinct, to be like, hey, we're gonna press on, we're gonna do this. You are leading the service. You're not commentating on it. And I think that was something that, as it was kind of drilled in, was like, oh yeah, because I think the temptation is to think, oh, I'm service leading, that means I've got a sheet of stuff that someone's given me and I'm going to read this out. Just a reminder, we're going to sing now because we always sing. Like, no. Like, actually, you're leading people into something. And so I think to be asking questions in the lead up as you're preparing, like, what am I leading people into? Like, God, what do you want to lead your people to tomorrow or right now even? So I kind of try and hold those two things in balance. being the thermostat, being the guide. They're both clumsy images and they both fall down, but that's kind of the core of what goes through my mind for service leading.
There's so much good stuff in there. And again, it's that idea of leading people, always pointing towards God, and not just the gathering for the sake of just gathering.
Because we do every Sunday.
Why change habits of a lifetime? But also I think what he says about recognising where people are at and helping them to put aside the things of the week and to really get into the right space for worship, thinking about that in the build up and the preparation and thinking of others, but then sort of that active leading people through it rather than just reacting to what probably is sort of a fairly muted and quiet response or atmosphere in congregations for us British churches.
Yeah, that's sort of just being proactive and getting confused about thermostats and thermometers. I wouldn't be able to remember the phrase, but yeah, kind of like taking a lead and saying like, no, God is good, this is where we're going today, and you might not be feeling it right now. But sensitively leading people through that. I really love the tour guide analogy as well. Just not assuming anything of people, not assuming that people know what they're supposed to be doing or why we do certain things that might seem weird to people. And I think this goes for the practical aspects too, like where to park or where to go in the new building, who to see. I think that's kind of a lot of the stuff that we covered in Through the Eyes of the Newcomer in episode 34, which I think actually it's that, again, thinking of others and thinking how their experience of it is. So sort of, considering the new people in our preparation and trying to avoid the complicated church language, the Christianese that really it could be quite upsetting, I think, and make people feel really silly if they don't understand it purely because they've never actually been told what half of that stuff means. Yeah, it can be jarring, and I think that goes for names as well. And obviously, like with all of this, it's difficult because we're trying to strike a balance between those who are new and those who have been at the church forever. But asking someone to find Janet is a really potentially difficult thing. Like if that's find Janet to sign up to the event, how do they know? Whereas actually even just saying Janet will be waiting to meet you over next to the refreshments at least points them in the right direction, and she'll be wearing a lanyard. It's all about that. We're not changing anything, we're not doing anything drastic, but just trying to gently lead people through it.
I mean, I have to say the church I was at in Plymouth, lovely bunch of people. Very often actually I didn't know half of their names, and I'd have had conversations with them and stuff, but it just had never been like, I don't know, you have those weird times of never actually formally being introduced, and then it's like been 6 months and you're like, I don't know how to ask for your name. And so someone did say the same thing of, oh, you need to speak to Janet, and I was like, I don't have a clue who Janet is. And then and then they pointed and I was like, oh right, well that's helpful. So that's not just for new people. So next let's hear from Liz and her thoughts.
Tips on leading church well. So I think that we need to ask ourselves, so what, a little bit more. I've sat in church services where people have said, we're launching this and we're doing this and you all should come and it's really important and you should be there. And, I'm a mum, I work full time, I don't have the time to add on something. And I sit there and I go, so what? I'm probably not the worst critic, but having a comms background, you can think about these, you do think about these things a little bit more. And I sit there and I go, oh, so what? So what? Why? And I think sometimes we just can, when you lead a service, you can say stuff and you can just think that, well, everyone will come and everyone will do that. And I think we need to be a bit clearer in like, why are we doing this? What's the reason? What's the impact going to be? What are the benefits to the people who are in the building? Rather than just kind of saying, you should come, and that's the end of that.
Yeah, so we've talked so many times about how Sunday notices can be a really key part of your comms strategy and getting messages to the church. But at the same time, just because something is said from the front on a Sunday doesn't mean it's communicated. So we should be carefully prioritising what events or messages we choose to include in the Sunday service, so that we can make the most of people's attention.
Yeah.
But how we announce things is really important too. So as Liz said, it's really important to sell the benefits. Why should people care about what we're promoting? People have really busy lives, so we shouldn't assume that people care just because they're hearing about it in church.
Yeah. When preparing this episode, we thought it would be good to ask the experts. So we put a question out on social media. What does it look like to lead a service well?
Yeah, so first up from Amanda. From my perspective, leading well is about quality, Christ-centered content, delivered with integrity and without anxiety. Afterwards, I'm thinking about how I felt, whether I communicated what I meant to, and what responses I get. We also review services as a leadership team. Yeah, really helpful. Thinking about what it actually looks like to do it well and reviewing that and seeing what worked well and what didn't.
Yeah, I think that reviewing is good because, it's nice to be like, well, that went really well, but also going, maybe that's room for improvement. And it keeps sort of a reflective attitude.
Yeah. And from Ray, having been on a leadership team as an administrator, it seems to be a cross between biblical servantship and natural, almost worldly charisma. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think it's something we cover today, but charisma is quite a key thing. And actually, there are some people who just aren't very good at leading services because they're just not very good at speaking to people and seeming enthusiastic. And I'm not saying they shouldn't be doing it, but yeah, it does take a certain amount of charisma to lead a room full of people.
Yeah, and it's again finding that fine line between, I don't want to say a sense of showmanship, but that kind of or performance, but I think it is about keeping people engaged because you could just read something and it be very dull, or you could do a fairly simple Sunday service, a Sunday school service, and actually it be done in a very engaging way that you come away remembering what was said rather than a bit of a talk.
Yeah. I mean, like, one really quick instant tip: smile.
Yeah.
Smile at people while you're leading the service. Look like you want to be up there rather
that's
than
a
you
good
can't
idea.
wait to leave, because people will buy into that emotion. And if you look like you can't wait for it to be finished, they will also be feeling like they can't wait for it to be finished.
Yeah. And actually on that as well, look up. I've had it before where it's been down and I'm just reading this and you're like, okay, well, then none of the rest of us aren't here. But yeah. And so then Dave says, the role of the service leader is to draw people closer to God in that space of worship. Less of us, more of him. I see it as having gone well if there are ways in which that is evident through the service and afterwards. It can be through a myriad of ways, and it's not always seen by us as servant leaders. I think that's quite true of it being less of us and more of him. So it's again that balance of not it being performative because I want the attention, but actually are we doing it to point to a place of worship and attention towards God? But also actually it's not always through us seeing it. I've led worship and I've been like, oh, I didn't really feel that. And then someone's come up and been like, oh, that was really wonderful. That was such a, I felt really connected to the Spirit. And that I'm like, wonderful. I didn't really get that, but that's amazing that you did. And that's cool.
Yeah, for sure. So Rob has given us, it's a bit longer here, and he kind of splits part of it speaking about leading, and then part of it speaking about preaching. So leading first. Leading, I actually find easier. It helps, however, when you have a basic framework to use. In my case, that's the service of the word framework in common worship. So that, as we alluded to right at the beginning about liturgies, and that framework can be helpful, even if it's not a liturgy, having your own framework. Back to what Rob said, I'm interrupting him. It's very dynamic and easy to slot things in and out of. Cool. So there you go. The framework that you can put things in and out of. However, if I'm leading, I prefer to preach as well, as it follows the flow of things to work better, in my opinion. Knowing the congregation also helps massively. It means you will know when and where you can, for example, have a moment or two of lightheartedness where it's appropriate. With preaching, it's always about what's spoken to you in particular from a passage. What's the first thing or specific thing that's speaking to you, and work from there. You don't want to overwhelm people with tons.
Yeah.
then be open that what you've prepared may have to change slightly and things may not work exactly as you have planned. Roll with it. God's got you, so you've got this. And then just to finish off with what Rob says about reflecting on what it means for service to have gone well. So the reaction from the congregation as you talk and lead, feedback afterwards, and generally there is a feeling of drained satisfaction that watches over you as an indication of putting your all into it. And yeah, I can relate to that, of that sort of drainedness that you put your all into it. I wouldn't necessarily say that's one for one that it means it's necessarily been gone that well. But yeah, if you have actually worked hard at it, that's something that we should mention, that for some people this is a lot more natural, that they can present and they can speak and they can make it feel natural without it seeming like too much work. Now that doesn't mean it's not cost them time and energy to get it right, but it comes a bit more naturally. For others, not so much. Either way, you can come away from it completely drained. So we are not in any of this saying service leading is easy, and we're not saying it's something that you should take lightly or not care about.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And then finally, from our social media responses, we've got Addison. For me, it's primarily about creating the best possible experience for new visitors while clearly communicating the truth you set out to communicate that week, while allowing the Spirit to move in the church service.
I think we should have just taken that comment from Addison. Just that could have been the whole episode, to be honest. They've described the balance there so well. There's new people, there's communicating truth, and then allowing the Spirit to move within that. Brilliant.
Yeah.
So let's change tack a little bit here as we hear from Francesca.
Yeah, so I think my top tips for leading church services well would be to enjoy it and to find ways to connect with your congregation. Sharing stories is really, really helpful, and being honest, and knowing that you're unique, and so don't try and be like somebody else, but try and remember that God has made you in a very unique way, and therefore the way you speak and how you present is yours, and have a good time.
Yeah, we should mention that among other things, Francesca is a speaking coach. So I'm sure if she was focusing on that nitty gritty practical, then the pace and tone of voice would definitely be in there too. But being yourself when you lead, you'll often find that not only do you enjoy the process more, but actually you'll deliver with confidence, and that inspires confidence in the people that you're leading too. Yeah,
that imparted confidence is something that comes up again and again, and it's so critical because if you're not confident, then people won't go with you confidently, as we've already sort of hinted at. And one of the ways to be confident is be yourself, bring your own flavor. Obviously this is within the sensitivity of the culture of the church, and just being sensitive to the church itself in how you do this. It's great to try new things, but if you try to do too much, you can lose people along the way. So it's always that balance. At the same time, whatever you do, if you do it with confidence, the chances are that people will go with you on it.
Yeah.
So let's hear a little bit more from Oz, thinking about ways of service leading that might be unhelpful.
I think when the tone of the leader doesn't match the content that they're saying, authenticity really matters in our culture, how we embody what we're saying. And so the importance of passion and vulnerability at the same time, depending on the context of what's being said, really helps people go, wow, this matters. Oh, this person's real. Or that story prompts me to honestly ask myself, where am I before God? And if this is the God I come to, I've got to get my heart in the right place and rely again on God's grace.
Yes, again, that's some good stuff, but it's all tied together. So being confidently creative is great, but actually we also need to be real and authentic with people. And that is something that we come back to again and again with all types of communication, not just in service leading. It's that double-edged sword of authenticity giving us the power to our communications, but it's also, it can undermine our message if we're actually not being authentic.
Yeah. And picking up on that last bit he said of pointing people to the God that we come to and the importance of helping people to have their hearts in the right place, that's something that as service leaders we should also be applying to ourselves. And it's often mentioned, I've seen loads of it online on social media recently with regards to worship leading, that in order to lead people effectively on a Sunday morning, we need to be making sure that our heart and our attitudes and our disciplines are in the right place throughout the week.
Yeah.
And this is especially the case when the actual act of doing the leading on a Sunday requires a lot of concentration. And I think we need to recognize that when we're serving or leading, that is the job that we are there to do at that time.
Yeah.
As much as we can still be blessed and we can feel that connection with God as we're doing it, we're there for other people more than for ourselves. So if I'm singing and playing guitar to lead the congregation, of course there's an element where I'm directly worshipping God by doing that. But me being so lost in the moment that I'm singing the wrong words or playing wrong notes, that's actually doing a disservice to the people that I'm trying to lead. And so by concentrating on leading them and doing a good job in that, that itself is an act of worshipping God, serving his people. And something which really helps with this, whether it's music, service leading, or anything we're doing, is being prepared and preparing enough. So we're not having to react or think in the moment because we've thought things through beforehand, and we can be fully in the moment of what we're leading without having to figure out then what comes next.
Yeah. So next we have Peter.
Understand the theme. Understand how you're going to communicate that theme through different media. And by that I mean, what's going to be prayer, what's going to be personal storytelling, what's going to be the word-based preach, what's going to be the music, what's going to be the response time, what's the ministry afterwards time going to look like. So understand the theme and how all of the elements feed into that theme, so there's a kind of coherence to it. And I think that needs to be worked through with the 4 or 5 key people who are going to put that together. The preacher, the service leader, the worship coordinator, the prayer team. I think out of a good discussion in advance, you ought to be able to land a coherent theme that isn't then like wooden, but lives in the moment. But there's order to it, there's pattern to it, there's shape to it, there's liturgy to it. But the liturgy needs to allow for that variety and difference of the culture.
So, as is often the case with Peter, there's quite a lot there in a short space of time. So we'll probably meander a bit in covering it and coming back around to things. But first of all, that idea of the theme of the service and the overall structure, not only why each element of the service is there, but how it all fits together and the coherence of it. So putting this in the most simple, practical way as possible, one of the most common pitfalls that I see in services is not leading on to what's next. So when you're leading the service, you are in charge of what happens from the front for the next hour or so. And hopefully your service includes getting other people involved, so it's not just all one person's voice for that whole time. But of course that can bring a disjointedness with it. So if the next item up is going to be led by someone else, you need to be keeping half an eye out to check that they're ready to step in and do it. And given that your capacity to wrangle people is limited while you're actively leading, it highlights the importance of preparation. So if you've asked someone to do a reading, before the service starts, make sure that they've showed up. And this isn't because everything has to be 100% slick and clockwork, but there is a sense that when there are these big awkward gaps, and actually little gaps feel big and awkward when there's 100 people sitting in a room or 30 people sitting in a room, people will switch off or just lose a little bit of concentration or confidence in what's going on, and it makes them less likely to listen and potentially distracts them out of that place where you're trying to lead them to, of being in that mindset of focusing on worshipping God.
Yeah. So smaller churches do not have the luxury of a dedicated stage manager who can be running around in the background making things happen. So as the service leader, this does fall to you. And that doesn't mean necessarily that you should be constantly on stage or standing at the front, but it does mean being present and having an awareness. When you're not leading the current item, you are ready to step in if something unexpected happens. Like potentially a video cuts out, or someone suddenly finishes speaking, or possibly the slightly more difficult one to deal with, someone is speaking for too long. Having this flow to the service, leading from one item to the next, there is a bit of an art to it, but it really isn't rocket science, and it does make a huge difference to those who are kind of watching the service.
Yeah, and this sort of competent leading, it's not flashy, but it's competent, it's thought through, and it gives confidence. It's not just for you as the service leader. You need to give permission to others who are involved in the service to do the same and to lead in the same way. So what does this look like? Well, I like to think of it as being a step ahead of the congregation, not behind them. There are loads of memes of like the worship group creeping back to the front at the end of the sermon as if they're so sneaky, and like comparing it to like animals sneaking around, and like, you know, but there's a sense in it, like as long as you're not causing a distraction, approaching the stage as a prayer or a song ends, or with the worship team at the end of the sermon, being ready for the next item can be really helpful and can give people permission to trust that you know what you're doing, rather than them looking around wondering what's coming next. So let your other contributors, let your musicians, let everyone know this. It goes for the PA team as well. You know, ask them to have the mic channel live a second or two before the person starts speaking, rather than a second or two after, where we get an awkward few seconds where you start talking, no one hears, and it comes on really suddenly, and we get that, hello, can you hear me? Cool. And then you lead on, and it just takes people out of the moment.
Yeah. I think on the same subject, it's as well giving people permission to interrupt, kind of maybe gently. You know, if your mic needs moving, it is okay. There's someone from the PA team to come up and move it slightly, either, you know, closer or further away.
Yeah, doing this will definitely cause less of a distraction than if half the church can't hear you properly for the service. And yeah, cue the turning around to look at the sound desk jokes that you see all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So stepping back a bit to what Peter said about the theme and making sure everyone involved is on the same page. Obviously, it does require communication whilst you're planning and prior to the service, and that might look like an email in advance with the general theme, followed up with song lists, and then even the final order of service as the day gets closer. However, what it doesn't look like is giving the PowerPoint to the AV team, 5 minutes before the service starts. That's really not very helpful.
I've been there.
Yeah.
And I mean, you'll be glad to know it's not just churches. That happens in the professional and corporate world as well, but churches should be setting an example, let's put it that way.
Yeah. But I think there's another thing to remember. It's the importance of communication during the service. A simple example could be, being able to send a text to the person who's on the PA. Now, obviously, it might be a bit difficult to communicate directly with the team whilst you're speaking, but knowing that you've got a song to be able to walk up and speak to them quickly, or just even send a text from the front, it can just help to give everyone a bit of confidence that you're all on the same page.
Yeah, we're not saying that the whole team should learn sign language, but I think just at least occasionally glancing at people to see if they're trying to make eye contact or get your attention can be really helpful. And just generally, it's about being switched on and aware of what's going on around you in the room. Obviously, in larger churches, as with corporate, as I've mentioned, they have talkbacks so they can speak to each other during the service. They have headsets to do that. We're not suggesting that. It might be helpful for larger churches if you've not thought about it, but most churches won't need that. Yeah. But I think just knowing that people doing different roles can communicate issues in some way is a helpful thing to consider, whatever that looks like in your church.
Yeah. I think that leads us nicely on to our last point, which is to have a pre-service meeting. Ideally, a get-together with others involved in leading the service, so whether that's your preacher, musicians, PA, AV, anyone really. But it gives you a chance to sort of bring up any last-minute changes or things to watch out for. However, it's not a reason to spring large things on people, just reminding people as opposed to bringing something new.
Yeah, or tweaking things. Often that might look like the musicians saying, we've said that we were going to repeat that chorus, but we're not going to because
take that
for
out.
sake of time, and just clearing people up so that it's not a massive surprise when things happen.
Yeah. It can be hectic before a service. I've been there myself. It can be very difficult to bring everyone together, but that's not an excuse, because actually skipping it will very often mean that people are feeling like they're winging it because they don't know what someone else has decided, and everyone's just hoping that things don't go wrong.
Yeah. And even more importantly, we want you to emphasize the importance of this meeting to your key players, because this is a time for prayer.
Yeah.
As much as we seek to be organized and lead people confidently and do all of these things that we've thought about today, it's essential to devote the time to God and ask his blessing on the meeting.
Yeah. So thank you to our contributors. For those from the clips, you can find out more about them by listening to their individual episodes throughout the series.
Yeah, and thank you to those who contributed from social media as well. We love to hear from you, and we love to not only to get your input, but to pass your input on to people as well. So we want to hear, what have you found helpful? Is there anything that we should have included today in thinking about service leading, or is there anything that we completely missed the mark on? So do drop us a message at hello@gppodcast.uk and tell us what's been helpful for you in leading your Sunday services and other church meetings.
Join us next week when we will be looking at all of our favourite communications, tools, resources and communities.